was one of the hardest days of my life. It was one of the best days of my life. My wife's name is Gretchen, in case you haven't met her. Our pregnancy had gone relatively well, no issues that we knew of. Our firstborn son, Ben, had been born about 2 years before that, and he was already a remarkable kid. He used to lay there in his crib at night and repeat the alphabet, and just amazing little boy. Now he's an amazing big boy. It was just about Gretchen's due date when my parents came out from, we were in Iowa at the time, living in a small town, and my parents came out from the Chicago area to our house to be there for the birth. You know, they wanted to try to gauge it so they get there in time to be there when the baby's born, and then afterwards, and they came, and a couple hours after they came, her water broke, and it's time to go to the hospital. And everybody's a bit nervous because we're about half hour away from the hospital, and you know how that goes. But we arrived with no problem, and Gretchen was in labor and continued in labor for about 20 hours, and it was horrible. Now, since our firstborn Ben had been born cesarean section, we had the choice as to the next one, and we decided to try one of those regular births. But after, we call it electing it. We elected that kind of a birth, and after 20 hours, we unelected it. And we prepped for a C-section, and as with the first birth, I was with Gretchen in the surgery room, and it's funny how the nurse was more concerned about me than she was about my wife. I guess a lot of dads faint, so she was constantly asking me, "Are you okay, Dad? Are you all right, Dad?" I was fine. I had a camera. I was taking pictures. This was great. And I watched my second son being born, and everything seemed good. The phone rang, and right in the surgery room. No, everything seemed good. We rejoiced at having our new baby. He cried. You know, it's a boy. They cleaned him up. They put him in his little bassinet, and I took a good look at him, and I did what all good dads do. I counted his fingers and toes. Yep, they all add up. And then I looked at his face. And I got this real uneasy feeling. Do I see what I think I see? His face seemed round, flattish. His eye slits seemed long and thin. To me, I wasn't an expert at this, but to me he looked like one of those people that had Down syndrome, and I was stunned. I wasn't prepared for this. And maybe I'm wrong. Maybe I just am not seeing this. And what do I know about this stuff? I'm no doctor. So they moved Gretchen to the recovery room, and a nurse was there with us, and she did her thing, and everything seems to be going well. Gretchen was doing okay, and then the nurse moved out of the room to do something else, and I followed her, and I said, "Excuse me, but I couldn't help but ask you a question. I'm not an expert at this, but it looks to me like my son has Down syndrome." And she said, "Yeah, we think he does." And I was stunned. And Down syndrome. I mean, I don't know anything about this condition except from what I've seen. They used to call these kids mongoloids, of all things. I mean, is that what my son is? Well, what am I going to do? I wondered if my wife sees this. Gretchen sees this? I didn't think that she did. And so I went to call my parents to tell them the news, you know, good news and not so great. And my dad said, "Well, just be strong and let your wife get her rest tonight." So I didn't say anything to her and went back to the room and wanted to go out and went to a nearby convenience store just to pick up some snacks and stuff because we were going to be there the night. And I remember walking around that store like I was just in a daze. This can't be real. This can't be happening. This has got to be a dream, and I don't like it. And when I got back, Brandon was with Gretchen, and I looked at him, and on the one hand, I felt a terrific sadness, but on the other hand, I felt an incredible love. I didn't sleep much that night. You know those little rollaway beds they roll into hospital rooms for dads? I don't fit on those things. I don't fit. I just don't. And I didn't sleep that night anyway. I woke up the next day, I was just exhausted. And so I went over to Gretchen, and then some more nurses came in, and I followed them out, and I said, do I see what I think I see? And they said, yeah, we think he does have Down syndrome. So I went back into the room, and I sat with Gretchen, and she didn't know. She didn't see it. And so I told her, and we cried together. We have a gift from God. We have a son, an addition to our family, and he has Down syndrome. It's one of the hardest days of my life, and it was one of the best days of my life, because I had a son who was born with a condition that I could not change, that wasn't going to go away. It was one of the hardest days of my life. But I had a son. It was one of the best days of my life. We treasure him very much. And now I can't imagine living life without him. And over the 17 years since then, I have learned many reasons why it was one of the best days of my life. If you don't know him, because he's not here on Sunday mornings, because he has seizures and we have to let him sleep, so he just doesn't come on Sunday mornings. If you've never met him, that's what he looks like. Yeah, he's our guy. But he is 17 years old. He has the developmental ability, cognitive ability of a 2-year-old, and he doesn't say words. Makes a lot of noise, but he doesn't speak. And what could a guy like that, who can't say anything, who is developmentally like a 2-year-old, what could he possibly teach me? And yet he does. And I'd like to share some of the things that he has taught me in the last 17 years. So, what is Down syndrome? Let me give you some background on this if you're not familiar with this. As I wasn't at the time, what is it? It's technical, but it might help you in understanding him. Our son came along. The only thing that I knew about him knew about Down syndrome was that they looked a certain way and they were very slow in their cognitive development. Down syndrome is a chromosomal condition caused by the presence of all or part of a third copy of chromosome 21. So it's often called trisomy 21 for that reason. It is the most common chromosomal abnormality in humans, and usually it is associated with mental slowness, retardation, or delay in cognitive ability, delay in physical growth, and certain facial characteristics. The average IQ of a person with Down syndrome is 1/2 that of a person without. Now, where'd the name come from? There was a guy by the name of John Langdon Down, a British physician who described the syndrome for the first time in 1866, so it's become known as Down's syndrome. It's about estimated that 1 in every 691 babies born in the United States is born with Down syndrome every year. It is not difficult to notice a person like this because they have certain physical characteristics, and I'm sure you know some of them. They have small chins. They have thin, wide eye slits, usually with a fold of skin underneath. They have a flat nasal bridge, small ears, protruding tongue comes from a small mouth, a flat, broad face, a short neck, extremely flexible joints, short fingers, and a large space between their first and second toes. They tend to be shorter, heavier, have bowed legs. They have a higher risk for medical conditions. And they used to have an expectancy of life of 12 years back in 1912. And now the life expectancy for Down syndrome people is 60 years. But with that comes some risks, because many in their 40s and 50s now develop dementia. Many develop epilepsy, seizures. About 50% of them are born with congenital heart disease, and often they have eye issues resulting in the need for glasses because their eyes don't focus together, thus giving them poor depth perception. And often they suffer hearing loss because they have tiny ear canals that result in many recurring ear infections. And my son has many of them. He doesn't have the congenital heart problem, but he has many of the other issues. So they have a lot of health stuff going on. Brandon is a little different. Brandon is a 1 in a million one in a million. If there can be something called a normal Down syndrome person, he is not. His 21st chromosome actually broke off and reattached. So his did it a little differently. So he is not like any other Down syndrome person. He is so hard to figure out that the people who work with him, after they've worked with him for a while, eventually come to us and say, "What do you think?" They do. Because he's so hard to figure out. He's just not normal Down syndrome. Didn't know this? Pregnant women can have a test done to determine whether their baby has the characteristics of Down syndrome, which we didn't do. We didn't need to do it, didn't want to do it. And I've also read that for women in the United States, 92% of them who come back with positive results for that test, 92% abort their babies. At one time, people with Down syndrome were also called mongoloids. So where did that come from? It came because it was determined that the people had the same facial characteristics as a tribe of people in the country of Mongolia. So they started calling them mongoloids. But the World Health Organization officially dropped that categorization in 1965 after a request from the Mongolian delegate who said, "Would you stop calling these people mongoloids because they're not from Mongolia?" So their name was changed to Down syndrome. In the past, many of them were almost all of them were automatically institutionalized. But in these last few years now, we try to what they call mainstream them, fit them into society as best we can with their abilities. So the question is, what could my son, who has many of these conditions, who has the physical capacity, the mental capacity of a 2-year-old, doesn't say any words, what could he possibly teach me? A man who has a master's degree and can speak. And the answer is a lot. And I'm going to pass on some of the things that I have learned through them, and hopefully you will learn from them today too. So we're going to go to some scriptures. I know we're going to go a little overtime. Sorry, just get ready for it. But we're going to do that. I want you to go to Philippians chapter 4, verse 4. Philippians chapter 4, verse 4. Philippians chapter 4, verse 4. It says this, "Rejoice in the Lord always." I will say it again. Rejoice. Brandon has taught me about having joy in the simple things of life. Every night we have a routine before Brandon goes to bed. He comes after we've had a bath. He's had a bath and he gets his pajamas on. He comes into the kitchen and he has a snack and he has some medication that he takes before he goes to bed. Then when he's done with that, it's time to go to bed, and I lead him into his bedroom. And when he gets a couple feet away from his bed, Brandon, you have to understand, cannot run or jump. He just doesn't have the physical capacity to do that. But when he gets close to his bed, as best as he can, he gets a running start, and he literally leaps onto his bed. And when he does, he laughs. Now, one time, a couple months ago, he got started a little too quickly, and he didn't quite make it all the way, and he actually hit the bed and bounced off and hit the floor. But then he, without any hesitation, I picked him back up, and once again, while laughing, he jumped into bed. And he sits there for a couple minutes after he gets into bed, and he laughs. He loves going to bed. I have never met anyone who loves going to bed more than he does. And I love going to bed, but I never jump and laugh when I get into bed. But he does. Why is that? Because something as simple, as routine, as matter of fact as going to bed is such a wonderful thing for him that he never, ever takes it for granted, and it brings him joy every single day. he teaches me not to take the very simple, the very routine for granted, but to have joy in every single part of life. He has joy. I want you to go with me to Psalm 139. Psalm 139. Verse 15. Psalm 139, verse 15. My frame was not hidden from you when I was made in the secret place. When I was woven together in the depths of the earth, your eyes saw my unformed body. All the days ordained for me were written in your book before one of them came to be. I have learned through Brandon that God takes care of us in ways that we cannot possibly foresee. Do you know that Brandon is 17 years old and he's never had a cavity? 17 years old and has never had a cavity. Why is that? We've done some research. We've talked to dentists, and they say that Brandon, as a Down syndrome person, Down syndrome people have an extremely low occurrence of cavities. Just does not happen. Various reasons have been given for this, the lack of a certain bacteria, certain things, but whatever reason, they just don't have cavities. When he was younger, we thought to ourselves, what are we going to do when we take this kid to the dentist and he has to get drilled? He's not going to know what this is. He's not going to take the pain. He's going to have to be put out because he would just be all over the place with this. It would be horrible. And in 17 years, God has taken care of that because he's never had to have a drill in his mouth. He always has a perfect checkup at the dentist. God takes care of us in ways that we cannot foresee. Speaking of teeth, Brandon, for much of his life, has been a grinder. Do you know, it's like the fingers on a chalkboard thing? There will be times at night when we have a monitor and we'll go into the other room and we'll listen to him, and we'll hear him in there and he'll be going, creak, 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 creak. He grinds his teeth. I don't know why, but he just started doing it. Now, what we were afraid of was that after a while, this was going to wear on his teeth, and it did. And his teeth began to be worn down, to shrink. So we said, what are we going to do when his teeth get all the way down to the nerve? He's going to be in horrible pain. So we went to the dentist one day, and we said, we explained the situation, and the dentist said, don't worry about it, because our teeth, when they are ground down like this, the nerve in the tooth actually on its own retracts. It pulls in by itself. Who would have thought? And yet God designed his teeth so that when he ground down his teeth, that he never would have pain because the nerve inside God designed to pull in when that happened. I was stunned by that. By the way, he doesn't really grind anymore, fortunately, but he did for a lot of years. But God took care of the problem. I want you to go somewhere else. Jeremiah 29:11. Jeremiah 29:11. Just letting you know, this verse is going to get real familiar to you because it's October's memory verse. Jeremiah 29:11. For I know the plans I have for you, declares the Lord. Plans to prosper you and not to harm you. Plans to give you a hope and a future. Brandon has taught me and my wife how God takes care of the future. About 8 years ago, Brandon started having seizures. He had a fever one night, had his first seizure, and has had them ever since. And we have struggled over those years. And the reason why Brandon is not here this morning is because lack of sleep is a trigger, and he can have seizures if he doesn't get enough sleep. So he sleeps as long as he needs to, so he doesn't have them. But we started having them. He started having them about 8 years ago, and went on various seizure medications. And each of them worked all right for a while, but after a certain period of time, they began to have some side effects. He began to have some rage episodes on these medications, and so they would switch to the next one, and it would be okay for a while, and then he would have the rage again, and they would switch, and finally after the third one, we just gave up, and now he's on Valium instead. But anyway, my point is that this we were at a conference, annual meeting out in Denver one year, and Brandon is very scheduled, and his world needs to be the same, or at least at that point, it would really set him off. And so there was at one point in the conference where I was in a meeting, and Gretchen was with Ben and Brandon, and they were out in the lobby of the hotel, and Brandon had just had it. And he went into a rage episode right there in the middle of this place. I was not there to help, and so Gretchen just did what she did. She grabbed onto him and basically just sank down to the floor and until he was able to calm down, and finally he did. And there was a lady who was watching Gretchen, and she came up to her and she said, "What are you going to do when he's as big as you are? How are you going to control this? What are you going to do then?" And Gretchen said, I don't think about tomorrow. I just think about today, because all I can deal with is today. And it was a few years later, he stopped having them. And now he is as big as she is, and he doesn't have them anymore. God took care of it. She could have said, "I don't know, I'm freaking out because I don't know what to do about the future, and I'm worried about this." But she said, "I'm just living today, and we'll take care of the future." And God took care of the future. Let me give you another example of this. When Brandon was little, haircuts were a nightmare. He hated having his head touched. You couldn't comb his hair, you couldn't brush his hair, or it would just set him off. So how are you going to cut his hair? So we would take him to the hair cutter, and it had to be both of us going. Because if he didn't like it, he would flail all over the place, and it's really hard to cut a moving target. Doesn't really work out too well. So what we do, we had a system, and Gretchen would sit in the barber chair first. Then I would pick Brandon up, and I would, facing Brandon towards Gretchen, I would force him down into her lap with his legs between, on either side of her. Then she would bear hug him, and I would hold his head, and then that's how his hair was cut. This was an aerobic experience because he was moving around all the time and flailing and trying. So we said, what are we going to do when the kid gets older? Again, when he's as big as she is. It was a few years ago. It was here. And we took, one day, it was time for haircut, but Gretchen couldn't go. She had a scheduling issue, and I'm sorry, you're just going to have to do this on your own. Thinking, what am I going to do? Just me. So we took him there, and I thought to myself, I'm just going to try something different. Rather than having him sit on me, I'm just going to let him sit and see what happens. So I led him up to the chair, and I sat him down, and we put the apron on him and all that stuff, and then very gently I just held his head, and she cut his hair. And he didn't flail, he didn't move around, he didn't do any of that stuff. And he's never done it since. There was a point where we actually got a prescription for Valium just for haircuts. We no longer have to use that. Because, now granted, he doesn't like haircuts, and he wants to get out of there as soon as possible, but nonetheless, he will sit there by himself and get a haircut. God took care of the problem. We did not have to worry about what happens when Brandon gets bigger than Gretchen because God took care of the issue. One more, John 13:34. John 13:34. A new command I give you. Love one another as I have loved you, so you must love one another. Brandon teaches me about love. So often in our relationships with people, why do we love them? Because of what they do for us. Because of how they take care of us, because of how they meet our needs, how they serve us, how they do all the things to make our lives better, and so in return we love them. Brandon doesn't do anything to earn my love. Brandon will never take care of me when I'm old. Brandon will always be Brandon. And yet I love him. Why is that? I love Brandon simply because he exists. That's it. Not because he does anything for me, but simply because he is there. He is never going to repay me for what I've done for him, and yet I love him. And you know what? That is how I am to love other people. That's how Brandon loves too. Brandon loves without condition. He doesn't care who you are. He will love on you. The way that he does that is either through a hug, or holding your hand, or giving you a kiss. But I have to warn you, his kiss is more like a lick. But it's a kiss. He doesn't care who you are. He will love you unconditionally. That's how I'm to love, because that's how God loves. That's how God loved me. I got another one for you. Matthew 5:14. Matthew 5:14. Matthew 5:14. You are the light of the world. A city on a hill cannot be hidden, neither do people light a lamp and put it under a bowl. Instead, they put it on its stand, and it gives light to everyone in the house. In the same way, let your light shine before men, that they may see your good deeds and praise your Father who is in heaven. Brandon teaches us how to minister to people. Brandon teaches me how to minister to people. We had some friends come in from out of town. They had two little small kids. We wanted to take them out for dinner. We took them out for dinner. We went to Logan's, I think it was. And we had a good time. Now, granted, you understand that when we go out for dinner, that Gretchen and I have, when we seat Brandon, we have to sit on either side of him, because although he can feed himself, he's had some stomach surgeries due to reflux, and if he gets too much in him, it can get stuck. So we have to regulate how he eats, basically, feed him so that he's okay. And from time to time, I have to take him out to the bathroom to change his diaper and all that good stuff. So we were sitting there doing what we normally do. They had their kids there. We had our kids there. We were having a good time, laughing, having fun. And the meal was over. It was time for us to leave. And as we usually do, I walked Brandon out first. And we walked through the restaurant and walked by the people. And on our way out, people, they watch us. They look at Brandon. They look at me. That's just the way it is with him. We walked out, and then Gretchen was staying behind to pay the bill. And as she was leaving, she walked by a table in the restaurant, and as she walked by, a lady sitting down at the table pulled her arm. And Gretchen stopped, and the woman said, "I just want to tell you that I've been watching you. And I just want you to know that I was very touched by the fact that you and your husband have joy in the midst of your situation." She said, I I've been dealing with some really hard times in my life, and after watching what you go through and that you have joy in the midst of it, I've decided that I can make it too. That's what she told her. And then she left. Now, we didn't go into that restaurant with the idea to teach people some lesson that God had given to us as we were there in the restaurant, but because God had given Brandon to us, and because we have learned to have joy in the midst of whatever he brings along in his life, that we can minister to people in ways we never would have been able to do it before. And people's lives can be touched simply because we have joy in the midst of the hard things of life. That's what Brandon teaches me. One more. Psalm 139, verse 13. Psalm 139, verse 13. For you created my inmost being. You knit me together in my mother's womb. I praise you because I am fearfully and wonderfully made. Your works are wonderful. I know that full well. Brandon has taught me that which I see as imperfect, God sees as flawless. That which I see as an inconvenience, God sees as a gift. A few years ago, someone gave us an essay that was written by Morris West entitled, "You Need a Sign," and they gave it to us, printed it out, and they inserted Brandon's name into it, and I'd like to read to you what it says. You need a sign. What better one could I give you than to make this little one whole and new? I could do it, but I will not. I am the Lord. I gave Brandon a gift I denied to all of you, eternal innocence. To you he looks imperfect, but to me he is flawless. Like the bud that dies unopened or the fledgling that falls from the nest devoured by the ants, Brandon will never offend me as all you have done. He will never pervert or destroy the work of my Father's hands. Brandon is necessary to you. He will evoke the kindness that will keep you human. His infirmity will prompt you to gratitude for your own good fortune. More, he will remind you every day that I am who I am, and that my ways are not your ways, and that the smallest dust mote whirled in darkest space does not fall out of my hand. I have chosen you. You have not chosen me. This little one is my sign to you, so treasure him. These are some of the things that God has taught me, and I hope he teaches you. God will take care of the future, often in ways we cannot possibly foresee. We are to love people unconditionally. God will take care of us. God will teach us. God will be with us. And God can minister through us as we have joy in the midst of the trial. We don't have to say anything. Just live with joy, and it'll touch people's hearts. And I've learned, and I hope you learn, that imperfections are a gift. They're flawless. And they're perfect. That's what God has made them to be. And we need to thank him for that. I hope you've learned from what I've learned. We don't all have to go through this to learn, but we all can. Let's pray. Lord, sometimes we have things happening in our lives that we didn't see coming, we didn't expect, we weren't prepared for, But they're there. And we have a choice as to what we will do with them. We can fret, we can fume, we can be anxious, we can be angry. Or we can appreciate what they are and what you can do through what you've given to us. Lord, I thank you for the gifts that you give to us like this. I've shared mine, and many here have theirs to share. Thank you for them. Help us to truly understand the gift that they are, to treasure them, to learn from them, to grow in them, and to thank you for them. In Jesus' name, amen.